Huge areas of Ontario have spotty or even no internet service. That includes places across the north, more remote areas in central and southern parts of the province, and even urban households that simply can't afford top-shelf broadband packages. COVID-19 helped drive home just how bad it is. Will this election press whoever forms the next government to fix this? With us for their insights in North Bay, Ontario, Susan Church. She's Executive Director at the nonprofit technology development organization Blue Sky Economic Growth Corporation. And in Richmond Hill, Ontario, telecommunications policy and research consultant Reza Rajabiun. And it's great to have both of you with us tonight here on TVO. Susan, to you first. What's broadband internet like across Ontario these days?
That's a really difficult question to answer because it's completely different depending on where you live. And I think that's, for me, that's the meat of the matter, in that when we talk about what can we do to improve it, when we hear all of the policies of the various parties, you can't speak with one cup. It's not half full and half empty. It's different everywhere.
Well, we're going from Toronto to North Bay right now and we're on the internet talking right now. This line seems pretty clean. Would you agree?
Absolutely. And I think that's another point that we have to, and I hope to discuss during our conversation today, is that there seems to be all of a sudden, and I've been kicking around this for a very long time. And when we first started, our goal was to try and get to 3 megabits per second down. That was considered blistering fast. And all of the government programs were designed to achieve those goals. So now when we're looking at 50 by 10 megabits per second service, one has to remember that, for example, right now, you and I are talking over at 15 by 2. So that's where I'm at. So I think we also have to put that into the conversation, that when there's discussion about the have-not communities, maybe it's not always targeting 50 by 10, but something somewhat lower.
All right, Reza, I can tell you that obviously ever since COVID hit, we have been doing probably 99.9% of our interviews this way. In other words, not in the studio, but over the internet. And I know you're only in Richmond Hill, which is not that far away from where I am right now. But I can tell you, we've done some interviews in downtown Toronto where the line disintegrates before our very eyes all the time. In downtown Toronto, in hospitals, for example, which you would think would have reasonably good service. How does that happen?
It's older infrastructure. So in a lot of areas, there has been competition and you have upgraded cable and fiber networks in an urban area like Toronto. But in some older neighborhoods, big buildings that copper lines were used a long time ago, or let's say subdivisions where I'm living. So I'm about half a kilometer from Yonge Street, but I was telling your producer that if my internet goes out all the time, so I might have to switch to mobile hotspot. And it's because it's an older subdivision that was built in the 1990s, so the lines are old, and it's too expensive for either for any of the telecom providers to actually deploy the fiber all the way to the home of the users.
Well, maybe you could follow up with this, because I noticed that when I talked to Susan, the line is pretty sharp. The picture's pretty good, the line's pretty sharp. But here I am talking to you, and you're a 20-minute drive north of me, and the picture is, how would I describe it? It's sluggish. Like, it's not as sharp, it's sluggish. How can that be?
Well, it could be it could be the connection, but it could also be that I have an older computer and Susan has a nice new computer or is connected to a wireline connection at home versus I'm using the Wi-Fi. And so there's a lot of technical reasons that could be involved in it. But again, it could be the actual connection too. The one key, going back to the COVID issue, is, and the speed numbers that Susan brought up, is before COVID, slower speeds were generally good for sort of first generation applications like email and web browsing and downloading Netflix. But now it's not necessarily a question of speed, it's also the question of reliability and the sort of stability of the connections. And that can only come from adopting new technologies and sort of replacing the old ones. So what you've had happen since COVID began, you not only have had people wanting more higher speed packages, you've also had lots of acceleration of investment by the telecom providers, particularly in fiber networks in urban areas. And also in rural areas, they're not investing in fiber networks, but they are investing in wireless networks. So and then I guess that's sort of a segue to our discussion today, in the sense that the government of Ontario is making heavy investments in expanding reliable, high-quality fiber networks into rural areas.
Right. Well, we're going to look at what all four major parties have on offer in just a second. But Susan, I want to just follow up with you on this issue of speed. You dropped a bunch of numbers on us in your first answer, and okay, should I confess this in front of everybody watching here? I didn't really get what you were saying, because I don't know what 50 by 10 means and all that other stuff. So can you just explain for us, what does that mean, and what's considered a good speed versus a too slow speed?
You know, that's such a good question. And after I dropped those numbers, it occurs to me that, you know, that's part of the problem with this subject here. It is a very complex, convoluted subject. And, you know, I think users of the internet, first of all, many have such a difficult understanding what it all means. And I really think we have to start focusing on that, so that customers can begin to understand it better. And so, for example, you know, my colleague on the panel was very correct. When a slower speed, such as 3 gigabits per second, and to put it in layman's terms, that's sort of the speed it travels down the highway or down the tube from its original connection. And when you add to it, like Netflix or Zoom or Skype, things have to go back up the tube as well. And when that happens, that's when all hell's loose, your speeds slow down, and what was good 10 years ago is not good anymore. So, you know, our governments, both at the federal and the provincial level, are looking to bring 50 megabits per second down and 10 up to all consumers by 2025. That becomes a very difficult matter the more you get into rural areas, but certainly in older infrastructure as well.
Got it. So parts of Ontario are a 12-lane wide 401 on the information superhighway, and other parts are 1 lane in each direction. That kind of metaphor I get. Let's talk now about what the four parties have on offer, and let me invite you to just to be comfortable for a second here, because this is going to take a minute or a minute and a half for me to get through all this. So Sheldon, let's get going here. The PCs are offering almost $4 billion to get high-speed internet to everyone by the end of 2025. They'd invest more than $109 million in Telesat's low Earth orbit satellite network and invest $71 million in the Eastern Ontario regional network to improve cellular service access. How about the NDP? They're pitching affordable high-speed internet province-wide by or before 2025, same year. They'd target broadband speed of 1 gig symmetrical for download and upload, and ensure small and medium-sized service providers can compete. The Liberals, same year again, affordable broadband to everyone by 2025. They'd use existing public fiber infrastructure to expand small municipal or community-owned networks, and would invest in low Earth orbit satellites. And for the Greens, they would establish high-speed internet across rural Ontario, where, of course, they hope to make a breakthrough in this election. They'd make broadband internet an essential service, regulate the industry as well in order to support smaller local internet providers. Okay, let's start with this. Reza, everybody wants expanded broadband, and these parties are all promising to do it by or before 2025. Is that even possible?
Well, that connects to the $4 billion that you noted that's already was announced in the budget last year. That's not new money. It's a process that the government is running. So there is, given that the recognition and investment that they're making, there is going to be, the big constraint is going to be the construction capacity constraints on building the networks over the next few years. And also, it's not just Canada, lots of other countries are post-COVID recognizing the importance of highly reliable internet and fiber-based networks. So there is capacity problems on the fiber supply and equipment front too. And we just also had the federal government ban Huawei, which is going to drive up the prices on equipment, especially for smaller rural providers.
Just out of curiosity, do you support that decision to ban Huawei, even though they're sort of here and it's going to require some significant retooling by a couple of the telcos?
Well, I'm not a political person, but I'm an economist, so I can tell you the impact that it will have on prices for equipment in certain sectors, because they've been very competitive. So they put downward pressure on equipment pricing. So it is going to drive up the price of improving broadband, both for large and smaller telcos.
Okay. Susan, let me follow up on something that was in one of the platforms there, and that is supporting low Earth orbit satellites. What does all that mean?
Well, again, and part of the trouble with some of the information that as consumers we receive about broadband, it's easy to say, let's all do it by 2025. It's easy to say, we support new technologies. The simple fact of the matter is, until we start bringing it down to a level that consumers really understand what it's all about, it is really hard to have this discussion. With the low Earth satellite, and again, to make it simple, Elon's been Starlink. I think a lot of people are familiar with what he's up to these days. The difficulty is that when a new technology comes out, and in particularly this case, you need a lot of the infrastructure in place. With Starlink, it's not quite there yet. And so now what we're seeing is that it's beginning to slow down in terms of its availability. There's, I think, 2,500 satellites that are available. Now the wait times are into late 2023, and it'll take more satellites being, sent up into the air to make it all happen. So again, it's a new technology. It was absolutely wonderful when it first came out, still is for those who can't get internet any other way. But again, the solutions have to come down to a more basic level. What works best in rural and remote communities may not work well in congested urban areas. And what works in urban areas surely doesn't work in the rural and remote areas, because a different technology is needed at an affordable level to be able to do it. When you have something like the Great Canadian Shield involved, and you can't just lay fiber everywhere through rock. So there's so many aspects of the development and the input, how you actually do provide technology. It's not a simple question.
Sure. Reza, there's one thing here in the NDP plan that says target broadband speed of 1 gig symmetrical for download and upload. I think I need a translation of what that means.
That translation, it means that something that cannot be done with older technology, especially in rural areas. So you need fiber for that, essentially. So it means that you need to deploy fiber. You can target it, but achieving that in very, very remote communities and areas along rural roads might be very expensive. So for very remote users, it will be hard to achieve that 1 gig speed on wireless or low Earth orbit satellites. So
well, how do you actually do that?
Even under best case scenarios, they won't get there. So that promise is useful in the sense that it recognizes what has happened since COVID is that you have more demand, and you also have accelerated supply in urban areas. So actually these digital divides are widening rather than closing, because the quality is getting better in urban areas, low cost, where there's competition between facilities, between the cable cos and the legacy telcos. So in Ontario, between Bell and Rogers. But that competition is improving service quality and driving down prices. But you're not getting the same thing in other areas where that infrastructure competition is not that strong, especially outside of areas where there is no cable networks. right?
Yeah, Susan, maybe you could follow up on that in this regard. You know, once COVID hit, there are a lot of people that moved out of some of the biggest cities in this province
Yeah.
to some of the less populated areas of this province. But of course, they still wanted all the comforts of big city living, like powerful internet service and the ability to play
Yeah.
movies on Netflix and so on. Can you talk about what impact COVID has had in terms of that movement of people from the big cities to smaller communities?
For sure. That's such an interesting question because we get so many calls now from real estate agents or from the real estate boards that are working with their clients and wondering if the service is available. And we've really heard some interesting anecdotal incidents where people are saying to them, moving up here from an urban area, that access to the internet is more important to them than access to good water. They can fix their water. They can dig a better well. They can't bring internet to their home. No matter what they do, whether they use expensive mobile broadband like cellular broadband, which can be very expensive, it doesn't, they can't fix that on their own. And we had situations where even in my office, one of my staff has 4 children. And during COVID, he had to drive to the nearest library with his children and try and steal signal from the library, which of course ended up being for free. But in the beginning, it was such a mess because nobody knew where to go to get internet so that they could compete in their jobs that they had to do at home and also work on their schoolwork. So when people do move to more rural communities, and not just all the way up north, I mean, moving to southern Ontario, to eastern Ontario, where they move to a more rural area, find the same situation.
Reza, again, maybe you could follow up on your previous answer and talk to us about there are limitations on what broadband is capable of doing. And I wonder if there are just simply going to be, and you talked about the digital divide widening earlier, which is extremely concerning, are there simply going to be places in this province that are not going to be well served regardless?
No, I think there is enough of a political commitment to expand universal access in Ontario. And as you noted with the platforms, there is consensus around it. And that I think that reflects that it has been recognized as an essential service. And going back to the point that you're making about housing and affordability, this is also very important, let's say, in surrounding areas of GTHA. As we see, COVID has resulted in very strong increase in housing prices, both in urban and rural areas. But if you don't have good internet, you can't really sell a house because nobody will want to buy it. So you'll get a big discount. And there is development of systematic evidence on the impact of broadband on housing prices too. And I'll give a shout out to my colleague, Helen Hambley from University of Guelph, who's been doing a lot of work on this. And she has some studies that you see if you have wireless internet at home, home can only be connected via wireless broadband. There's a large discount on the price, controlling for the size of the house and the area where it is. Whereas if you have fiber or cable, there is a very large price premium that you can get for the house, so around 7-8%.
Isn't that interesting? So it's no longer nice
depends exactly
kitchens.
on their areas, and this is very important for municipalities because the value of the houses sustains them in terms of taxes. So in terms of long-term fiscal sustainability of the municipalities and tax base, it is important to improve that connectivity. And that's why I'm being somewhat positive that there is now recognition that these gaps are going to be closed.
That's very interesting. I guess the days of just nice bedrooms, bathrooms, and kitchens is not enough to sell a house now. You got to have good connectivity as well. And Susan, that makes me want to ask you, you're in North Bay. I imagine there's good service in Sudbury, Thunder Bay, Sault Ste. Marie. I mean, these are large Northern Ontario cities. Yeah. What if you get into much more remote areas of Northern Ontario? Do you think people are just going to have to suffer with an increasing digital divide for the long-term future?
And again, that's I'm so glad you brought that up because just to my fellow panelists, The concern is in those more rural areas of Northern Ontario, for example, wireless, which is, tower to tower, line of sight kind of connectivity, is the only solution that will be there. And we refer to it in cases as last mile. So large telcos can lay fiber, and then that last mile is where a small telecommunication company will come and take the signal from one spot, a POP as they call it, and then move it down a road to those rural areas. If there is no recognition of the massive role that small internet service providers are playing in this whole subject, then we are never going to achieve a balance between bringing that rural divide closer to the in spots. Because I can tell you, there are so many areas in Northern Ontario that will never see fiber. It just isn't, from an economic point of view. I've seen some of the projects that have been approved under the Universal Broadband and the ICON program, which is the most recent round of announcements, and it's $25,000 to $30,000 per household. And there are people who at $500 a household receive a wireless signal that, with the new equipment that is now available, would work equally as well. So I'm imploring all parties to look at the absolute importance for the small internet service provider. They're the ones that brought us this far, and they have to be the ones that are continue engaged in the conversation moving forward.
Reza, are you concerned that there is not adequate attention being paid to these smaller players, and therefore they may not be able to play the part in solving this that perhaps they could?
It's not a question of political attention. I think what has another impact of COVID has been that you've had a lot of consolidations of the smaller providers. They just couldn't keep up with the reinvestment that's needed. So we've had this in Ontario in a lot of smaller rural wireless providers, also out in Alberta. They've sold themselves. They've been bought by larger providers. So there is that market pressure. It is telecommunication network, so it is really hard to sustain yourself as a small provider. There's a lot of economies of scale, and there's variation around Ontario. For example, in Western Ontario, there is still a lot of smaller providers than in Northern Ontario. In other places, there's been a lot more consolidation. So it is, what can you do to support smaller provider is to have open and sort of, when you have procurement and subsidizing something, have open processes to give them the opportunity to participate. But you can't really discriminate between smaller and larger providers in procurement processes, right?
All right, so Susan, we got a minute left here. Let's say you find yourself in a situation with whoever becomes the next Premier of Ontario after June the 2nd. You buttonhole them at a conference and you say, okay, here's what you've got to do. Here's job one when it comes to service on this issue for across Ontario. What bug are you going to put in that person's ear?
I think that, and again, yesterday's announcement from the federal government to CRTC in terms of a new policy direction for, a number of items that will make things hopefully more even in the playing field will come into play. I guess my words of wisdom would be that we have got to just take this all down a notch. We don't know yet what's happening with the Accelerated High Internet program, which is about to be announced at the conclusion of the election, I would assume. Once we know that, that's when we're going to learn what small communities are still left over. Let's pay attention to them. Let's find the best possible way to use the dollars that will be left in both the UBF and the provincial programs. And let's pay attention to creative solutions. They may not be solutions that one would normally think of using. We have to get creative with new technologies. We have to be able to remember that the farmer that lives down that road, in order for him to compete globally, he has to connect. So we have to pay attention to the rural communities.
Sounds like quite reasonable advice. Susan Church and Reza Rajabiun, we want to thank both of you for coming on to TVO tonight and sharing your views. Take good care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.